Julia Roberts' famous laugh in Pretty Woman looks completely real. That's because it was. The story goes that director Gary Marshall did something strange off-camera to get that reaction. Roberts later pushed back on exactly what happened. The piano scene wasn't scripted either. Richard Gere sat down and improvised the whole thing. And here's the strangest part. The body on the movie poster isn't Julia Roberts at all. They used a model and placed her head on top. For a film about appearance and fantasy, even the poster was an illusion. What else did they hide in plain sight? Pretty Woman almost became a completely different movie. Long before it turned into a glossy romance, it began as something much harsher and much sadder. In the late 1980s, struggling screenwriter J.F. Lawton wrote a script called $3,000, named after the exact amount Edward Lewis pays Vivian Ward for 1 week of her time in Los Angeles. That title told you everything about the world he had in mind. There was no fairy tale in it. There was no soft glow around the characters. It was built as a raw story about survival, money, power, and the cold way people can treat each other when everything becomes a deal. In that first version, Vivian was nothing like the bright and lovable woman people remember from the final film. She was rough around the edges, angry, worn down, and deeply damaged by the life she had been living. Lawton imagined her as a woman trapped in addiction, stuck in a rundown apartment, and barely holding herself together. She was not there to charm anyone. She was there to survive. Every part of her world felt hard. And that was the point. The script wanted the audience to sit in that discomfort and feel it. It did not offer escape. It did not offer magic. It only showed what life looked like when love had no place in the room and everything came down to cash. That also changed Edward. In the movie, people know he is distant at first, but slowly opens up and becomes someone softer. In the original script, he was far colder than that. He was written as a man who looked at everything through the lens of business, even people. Vivian was not someone he rescued. She was just another arrangement, another deal, another thing he could control for a while and then throw away when he was done. That made the whole story feel less like romance and more like a brutal look at class loneliness and the way wealth can strip feeling out of human connection. And yet, even in that dark form, the script had power. It drew attention because it felt serious and sharp. It even earned praise through the Sundance Institute, which showed that people saw real dramatic strength in it. So the early version clearly worked on the page. Still, once Disney got involved, everything changed. The studio liked the bones of the story, but the tone scared them. The title sounded strange to them, and the script itself felt too bleak to turn into a big mainstream hit. So instead of leaning into the darkness, they started pulling the film in the opposite direction. That shift changed everything. What had started as a cautionary tale slowly became a fantasy. The studio wanted heart where there had been pain. They wanted warmth where there had been distance. They wanted audiences to leave smiling, not stunned. And that is where the movie began its transformation from a hard drama into the romantic comedy the world remembers. By the time it reached theaters on March 23, 1990, Pretty Woman had become something much lighter, much more crowd-pleasing, and far more hopeful than the script that first existed. That gamble paid off in a massive way. The film was made for about $14 million and went on to gross around $463 million worldwide. Part of what made that transformation so striking was how much Vivian herself had to change. In the original script, she was written in a way that would have shocked anyone expecting charm and sparkle. She was harsh, unstable, and consumed by addiction. Her life with Kit felt messy and desperate. There was nothing polished about her, nothing dreamy. Even Julia Roberts later admitted how dark that version was. She nearly walked away early on because the role felt so far from the version that later made her a star. And honestly, it is easy to see why. That original Vivian did not live in a story where things got better. She lived in a story where people broke down and kept falling. Then the rewrite happened, and that rewrite did more than soften details. It changed the soul of the movie. Vivian stopped being a figure of damage and became someone audiences could instantly root for. Her pain did not disappear completely, but it was no longer the center of everything. Instead, the focus shifted to her wit, her innocence, her honesty, and the strange sweetness that Julia Roberts brought to the role. That one change opened the door for the whole film to work in a new way. The audience no longer watched from a distance. They leaned in, they cared, they hoped. Edward went through the same kind of change. The original version made him feel emotionally empty, almost cruel, in the way he handled Vivian. He was not a romantic lead at all. He was part of the film's ugliness. But the final movie needed something else. It needed a man who could still seem powerful and closed off, yet slowly reveal vulnerability underneath. That is what Richard Gere helped create. Instead of a cold predator, Edward became a guarded man who had lost touch with himself and somehow found a way back through Vivian. That softer version changed the entire emotional direction of the story. Still, getting to that final version was messy. Early reactions to the darker material were not good. Test audiences hated the bleakness. They were upset by the cruel ending. They did not want to watch Vivian get used and discarded with nothing in return but pain. In the original ending, Edward throws her out of the car, throws the money at her, and drives away. It is ugly, sudden, and deeply humiliating. Julia Roberts later described how shocking that version was. There was no rescue, no grand return, no climb up the fire escape. Just a woman left behind holding money that suddenly means nothing. And it got even sadder after that. In one version of the story, Vivian goes back and takes a bus ride to Disneyland with Kit. On paper, that may sound almost playful. But in context, it felt empty. Vivian was not heading toward joy. She was drifting toward a hollow little dream with a blank look in her eyes. That ending did not feel hopeful. It felt numb. It made the whole story land like a quiet defeat. The message was clear. Some people do not get rescued. Some people only get a little cash and a long ride away from the place where they were broken. That was exactly what made audiences pull back. They did not want that kind of ending from this story. The chemistry between Roberts and Gere had already created a different kind of expectation. People wanted release. They wanted emotion. They wanted a payoff. So the studio listened. Different endings were tested. And one by one, it became clear that the darker versions were never going to win people over in a wide release. What finally worked was the one people still remember. Edward shows up. He climbs the fire escape. He brings flowers. And the story gives the audience the romantic release they had been waiting for. That new ending did not just save the film. It defined it. Suddenly, the whole movie clicked into place. The earlier scenes felt lighter. The emotions landed better. The romance finally felt earned inside the world the movie had become. It was no longer asking viewers to stare at pain and powerlessness. It was inviting them into a fantasy where two lonely people somehow changed each other. That one choice turned boos into cheers and helped transform the film into a phenomenon. A huge part of that transformation came from Gere Marshall. He was brought in to guide the project away from pure grit and into something warmer. He understood that the film could not survive in the space between ugly realism and romantic fantasy. It had to choose. So he chose heart. He pushed the script toward humor, softness, and emotional connection. He helped shape the famous moments people still quote. And he found ways to make the characters feel lovable without making them feel flat. That balance mattered. Without it, the movie could have fallen apart in either direction. Even the title changed because of that same shift. $3,000 sounded cold, blunt, and transactional, which matched the early script perfectly. But once the movie moved toward romance, that title no longer fit. Pretty Woman did. It sounded warmer, more inviting, more cinematic. It carried fantasy in it before the movie even started. Adding Roy Orbison's song helped even more. The film was no longer selling a business arrangement. It was selling a mood, a feeling, a dream. The casting journey added even more chaos to the story behind the film. Julia Roberts was not the studio's first safe choice. Big names were considered and many passed. Some disliked the script. Some felt uncomfortable with the material. Some simply were not right for it. Roberts, though still young and far from being the powerful star she later became, had something others did not. She had warmth that reached people right away. She had a natural openness that made even the sharpest lines feel human. Producer Gary Goldstein saw that early and pushed for her because of Mystic Pizza. Without that push, the film might have gone in a very different direction. The same kind of uncertainty followed the search for Edward. Several actors circled the role, including Al Pacino, who even did a chemistry read with Roberts before stepping away. Others were considered too. For a while, the role seemed unstable, almost like the movie was still waiting for the right shape. Then came Richard Gere. At first, he was not fully convinced either. He did not see much in Edward beyond a man in expensive clothes. But the famous story says that while meeting with him, Julia Roberts scribbled a simple note asking him to say yes. That tiny moment helped tip the decision. And once he joined the movie, finally had the pair that made everything work. Their chemistry ended up doing more than carry scenes. It changed the tone of the entire film. Roberts brought movement, light, and emotion. Gere brought stillness, restraint, and quiet charm. Together, they created a rhythm that made the romance believable. That balance became one of the film's greatest strengths. It helped audiences forget how dark the project once was, because what they saw on screen felt so alive and so easy to fall into. When Pretty Woman finally opened on March 23, 1990, it did well right away. It debuted at #1 with over $11 million in its opening weekend, which was already strong for an R-rated romantic comedy with such unusual subject matter. But what really surprised people was what happened after that. Instead of fading quickly, the movie held strong. In fact, it grew. Week after week, people kept showing up. Word of mouth kept building. Audiences went back for the shopping scenes, the opera, the humor, the chemistry, and of course the fantasy at the heart of it all. Its theatrical run became part of the story too. The film stayed around far longer than most expected, building into a true box office giant. It eventually made about $178 million in the worldwide. For a film made on a modest budget, that was an enormous result. It proved that people were ready to embrace a romance that mixed glamour with edge, even if the original script had once pointed in a very different direction. Critics were split, and that was not surprising. Some were swept up by the movie's charm, especially by Julia Roberts, who many agreed was impossible to look away from. Others were uneasy with the way the story dressed up prostitution and class fantasy in fairy tale clothes. That tension never really disappeared. It became part of the film's legacy. People argued about what it meant, what it softened, and what it ignored. But even those debates helped keep the movie alive in the culture. Love it or question it, people kept talking about it. And in the middle of all that, Julia Roberts became a star. Pretty Woman did not just give her a hit, it changed her life. She won a Golden Globe, earned an Oscar nomination, and stepped into a completely different level of fame. Her salary for the film was only a fraction of what her male co-star earned, but the success of the movie changed her value in Hollywood almost overnight. From there, she rose into the top rank of movie stars and later became one of the highest-paid actresses in the business. So the real shock behind Pretty Woman is not just that it was once darker, it is how close it came to staying that way. Beneath the famous dresses, the shopping bags, the smiles, and the sweeping ending, there's another version of the film still hiding in the background. A colder version, a sadder one, a story where nobody gets rescued and money solves nothing. That version had bite, and it had honesty, but it would never have become the cultural phenomenon people still remember. What audiences got instead was a movie that took the bones of something painful and turned it into fantasy. That shift changed everything. It changed Vivian. It changed Edward. It changed the ending, the mood, the title, the marketing, and even the way the world saw the two actors at its center. And in the end, that is what makes the story behind Pretty Woman so fascinating. It was not born as a fairy tale. It had to be pulled there scene by scene, choice by choice, until the darker version finally slipped away and the one people fell in love with took its place. Pretty Woman looks smooth on screen, but once you look closer, the movie starts to feel even more fun, because so much of its magic came out of little accidents, rushed fixes, and strange moments behind the camera. That is part of why people still rewatch it. It is not only the fairy tale that pulls them in, it is also the mess hiding underneath it, because the mess somehow made everything feel more alive. One of the funniest examples happens during the breakfast scene. Vivian is sitting in Edward's hotel suite talking with him while room service sits between them. In one shot, she is clearly holding a croissant. Then the camera cuts away for a moment, and when it cuts back, the croissant is gone and a pancake has somehow taken its place. On top of that, the food keeps changing shape as the scene goes on. It is a tiny mistake, but once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. The reason is simple. The scene was shot again and again from different angles, and the props kept changing during the day. Under hot lights, food never stays the same for long. What should have been a clean little breakfast scene turned into one of the film's most famous continuity mistakes. And strangely, that only makes it more lovable. The same thing happens in the etiquette lesson with Barney. He is teaching Vivian how rich people act at the table, and he confidently explains that a salad fork has 3 tines, never 4. It sounds polished and certain, which is exactly why the mistake lands so well. A second later, the fork in his hand clearly has 4 tines. The scene is trying to teach elegance, yet the prop gives the whole thing away. That little slip fits the movie in a weirdly perfect way, because Pretty Woman is always playing with the idea that high society looks flawless until you get close enough to see the cracks. Then there is Julia Roberts' famous laugh while Vivian lies on the floor watching television. It feels loose and real, almost too real for a movie. That is why people kept asking how they got it. For years, one of the best-known stories was that Gere Marshall was off-camera tickling her feet to make her laugh for real. Later, Roberts pushed back on the story a bit and made it sound less simple than that. Even so, what stayed the same was the feeling of the moment. The laugh did not feel forced. It felt sudden, bright, and human. That scene matters because it lets Vivian stop performing for a minute. She's not trying to survive charm or negotiate. She's just laughing. And once that happens, the audience leans even closer to her. Something similar happened in the bath scene. Vivian is alone in the tub singing along and enjoying herself, and the moment feels playful and free. Behind the scenes, the story goes that the crew slipped away during part of the take, leaving Roberts alone, so her reaction would be more natural when she opened her eyes. Whether every detail of that story stayed exactly the same over the years or not, the scene still carries that feeling of surprise. What makes it work is that it feels unguarded. Vivian is not posing there either. She's just having a moment, and the movie gets stronger every time it lets her feel like a real person instead of a polished fantasy. Even Richard Gere added something personal to that same kind of feeling. In the piano scene, when Edward sits down and plays the moment, it does not feel like a normal scripted beat. It feels private. That is because Gere actually played it himself, and the melody came out of improvisation. Instead of turning Edward into a man who explains his emotions with words, the film lets the music do the work. That choice deepens him without slowing the story down. Vivian comes in, the music fills the room, and for a little while the film stops chasing glamour and just sits with longing. Even the movie poster carries one more secret. The image became iconic, but the body on that poster was not Julia Roberts' body. A model posed for it, and Roberts' head was placed onto the image later. Once people found out, it became one more strange detail in the film's legacy. Yet that too fits the movie better than you might expect. Pretty Woman is built on appearance, image class, and fantasy. So the fact that its most poster is also a kind of illusion almost feels too perfect. But the more people loved the film, the more others pushed back against it. That is where the story around Pretty Woman takes a much sharper turn. For many viewers, it was a sweet romance. For many sex workers and critics, it was something much harder to accept. They saw a movie that turned danger into sparkle and made survival look like charm. That anger did not come from nowhere. It came from the huge gap between Vivian's world on screen and the real lives of the women the story claimed to be close to. Writers and advocates pointed out that Vivian is presented as special from the very beginning. She is beautiful, funny, quick, and somehow still protected by the logic of a fairy tale. Because of that, the audience is invited to believe she can be lifted out of danger by the right man with enough money. Critics argued that this kind of story hides the brutal truth of what most street-based sex workers actually face. Violence, coercion, arrest, addiction, poverty, and trauma do not shape Vivian's days the way they shape real lives. The film keeps brushing those things aside, and that is exactly what upsets so many people. It was not just that the movie softened reality, it was that the softening itself became the fantasy people remembered. That is why some critics said the film does not free Vivian at all. It simply moves her from one kind of power imbalance into another. Edward may be charming, but he still controls the money, the space, and the terms of the arrangement. The movie dresses that up with romance opera and expensive clothes, yet the imbalance never fully disappears. To some viewers, that made the entire story less like liberation and more like a polished version of dependency. The Rodeo Drive shopping scenes became one of the clearest examples of that argument. For many people, Vivian's return to the boutique is thrilling. It feels like payback. It feels like confidence. It feels like one of most satisfying moments in the movie. But critics looked at it differently. They saw a woman being validated not by her own power, but by a rich man's money. The famous line lands because it gives her revenge, yet the revenge is still bought. That is what makes the scene both iconic and uneasy at the same time. It works perfectly as a movie moment, but once you step back, it also reveals how deeply the story ties worth to wealth. That scene became even more interesting once people learned how it changed from the original script. In the early version, Vivian did not deliver a polished comeback. She just reacted more bluntly, more angrily, and with far less style. Later, rewrites sharpened the moment into something cleaner and more memorable. That single change mattered. It turned a rough act of defiance into a line people would repeat for decades. Suddenly, the scene was not just revenge, it was performance, and that is a big part of why it lived on. The writer J.F. Lawton helped shape that moment from something personal. Before the movie became a hit, he had his own experience of being looked down on in expensive stores. He knew what it felt like to walk into a place and be judged before saying a word. That humiliation stayed with him. So when Vivian was dismissed by saleswomen, the emotion underneath it came from something real. In that way, one of the film's most glamorous scenes was rooted in shame first. That may be why it lands so well. The fantasy works because the insult underneath it feels true. Even so, the film was softened again and again. TV versions cut or trimmed many of the rougher moments, especially the parts that made Vivian's work more explicit. Broadcasts made the story feel even cleaner than the theatrical film already did. So for some people, Pretty Woman became a fairy tale twice over. First in theaters, and then again on television. That widening gap between the version and the darker ideas behind it helped keep the debate alive for years. And speaking of darker ideas, one of the richest parts of the whole movie sits inside the opera scene. Vivian goes to see La Traviata, and that choice was not random at all. The opera tells the story of a woman marked by society, loved by a wealthy man, and pulled into a painful conflict between romance class and respectability. In other words, it mirrors Vivian's emotional world almost perfectly. The title itself means The Fallen Woman, which tells you everything about why it belongs in this film. That scene works because Vivian is not just watching a performance. She is seeing herself inside it without fully knowing how to explain it. The sadness hits her before she can protect herself from it. She cries openly, and that reaction matters because it shows the audience something deeper than wit or charm. It shows how much feeling she has been carrying under the surface. In a movie built on fantasy, the opera scene becomes one of the few moments where emotion cuts through everything else. The music in that sequence makes it even stronger. La Traviata is full of longing, sacrifice, and heartbreak, and Vivian responds to it as if she finally hears her own fear speaking back to her. The film may give her a happier ending than the opera gives Violetta, but it still borrows the emotional truth. Love across class lines is not simple. Desire does not erase shame, and being chosen does not automatically heal what came before. The movie wraps those truths in glamour, but the opera lets them breathe for a moment. That connection stayed powerful enough that later stage versions of Pretty Woman leaned into it even more. The musical made the link more visible, almost spelling out what the film had woven in more gently. That tells you how important the opera scene really was. It was never just decoration. It was the heart of the movie speaking in another language. And then there is the ending of the story, outside the story, which may be the wildest part of all. Pretty Woman was made on a relatively modest budget, yet it exploded into a giant box office hit. It earned far beyond what anyone expected. and became one of the biggest romantic comedies ever. That success changed everything around it. It changed how studios thought about star power, how they sold romance, and how they imagined low-budget films could break through. No one embodied that change more than Julia Roberts. Before Pretty Woman, she was still on the rise. After it, she became a star in a way that almost instantly reshaped her career. Her salary jumped. Her status changed. Her face became one of the most recognizable in Hollywood. The film did not just make money, it made a movie star. At the center of that lasting success sits one simple truth. Pretty Woman is full of contradictions, and that is exactly why people keep coming back to it. It is messy, but smooth. Sweet, but troubling. Funny, but built on something darker. It hides mistakes in sight, softens harsh realities, and turns awkward accidents into memorable moments. That strange mix is what gives it life. You watch it for the romance, then stay for the cracks. And once you notice those cracks, the whole thing becomes even harder to forget.